Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So when it comes to AWS S3 and when it comes to management, we have two configurations for the Solutions Architect Associate exam, which we are going to look at. The first configuration is called as lifecycle transition, and the second configuration is called as cross-region replication. So we are going to see these in very much detail and also look at the practical example of it. So when it comes to lifecycle transition, you can add your own rules in a lifecycle configuration to tell S3 to transition objects from one storage class to another. So when we looked at our previous lectures, we had many storage classes, right? So we have a storage class called as S3 standard. We have one called as S3 IA. We have one more called as one zone IA. Then we have intelligent tiering. And then we have a Glacier Deep Archive and Glacier storage classes. Okay, so based on these storage classes, we have our own cost aspect related to that. So if suppose I would like to transition some of my objects from one particular storage class to another, and this lifecycle transition has to happen in an automated fashion in the background, I will do this configuration. So when you know that some of the objects are infrequently accessed, like let's say for a scenario wherein we have an HR in an organization and she is accessing a lot of resumes, and let's say that she is not going to access some of the resumes that she sourced 3 months or 4 months before, we can go ahead and transition those respective resumes alone to a different storage class based on the kind of access. Okay, and so for that, what we will need to do is uh, you might want to go ahead and create a lifecycle transition rule, okay, that transitions the objects from S3 standard to S3 IA. And similarly, let's say that you're not going to access these objects for more than a year's period of time, or let's say for more than 180 days, or let's say for more than 250 days, and so on. So those kind of objects, you don't want it to keep lying within the S3 standard storage class where you're paying a higher fee and you're not even accessing these objects. So at that point of time, you would like to move these to an archival solution, which is to Glacier. So that is described in the second point. So you might want to archive some of the objects that you don't even access in real time. In real time means not frequently. Okay, so we can transition those respective objects to the Glacier storage class. Okay, so in this diagram, we are able to see that these are the different storage classes that we have, and these are the transitions that are allowed. So from standard IA, okay, or from S3 standard or from standard IA, you will be able to transition to one zone IA, which is described by this transition. You will be able to transition to Glacier directory. You will be able to transition to Glacier Deep Archive, which is their final archival solution that they have. So these are the three transitions that are allowed from standard IA. Okay, and then from intelligent tiering, you're only allowed to transition to Deep Archive and to Glacier, and then even to one zone IA. Okay, so you have three transitions denoted by the green arrows from intelligent tiering. From one zone IA, which is your storage class which stores your data only in that particular availability zone for very low cost, you will be able to transition those objects only into Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive to take in a much more lesser amount of charges for your data per GB or per gigabyte. Okay, and then when it comes to standard and reduced redundancy storage, it's very advantageous because from S3 standard, you'll be able to transition to all of these storage classes. So from S3 standard, you can transition to standard IA, you can transition to one zone IA, you can do to intelligent tiering, you can also do it to Glacier and to Glacier Deep Archive. Okay, in the next few slides, we will be looking at some of the transitions that are allowed and some of the transitions that are not allowed. Just to state this right now, it's not that important for the exam for you to remember which transitions are allowed and which transitions are not allowed, but still we will look at these. Okay, so you can transition from the standard storage class to any other storage class. So that's denoted by this diagram. So from the standard storage class, you can transition to any other storage class, and from you can transition from any storage class to Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive. So that means it states that from standard or from one zone, from intelligent tiering, from standard IA, you can transition to Glacier, and from Glacier you can see that transition can only go to Glacier Deep Archive. So there is only a forward transition that is allowed. So you can transition from standard IA to intelligent tiering or one zone IA, and then you can see over here, you can transition from the intelligent tiering storage class to one zone IA storage class. From intelligent tiering, you can do to one zone IA storage class. You can also do it to Glacier and to Glacier Deep Archive. And you can transition from Glacier storage class to only the Deep Archive storage class. So when you remember the table that we discussed when we are looking at the S3, I mean, class, we were looking at standard, which came first, and then we had standard IA, which came second, and then we had one zone IA, and then we had intelligent tiering, and then we had Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive. So only forward transitions are allowed, in the meaning that you can't do a backward transition from one zone IA back to standard, or one zone IA to standard IA, or one zone IA to intelligent tiering. That is not allowed. From one zone IA, your data can only go to Glacier or to Glacier Deep Archive. Okay, so those are some of the transitions that are not supported. So you can't transition from any storage class backward to the standard storage class. You can't transition from any storage class to the reduced redundancy storage class. You can't transition from intelligent tiering storage class to standard IA. So he means that you can't do it from intelligent tiering to standard IA. So a backward compatibility is not possible. Only forward transitions are possible. So only from standard IA to intelligent tiering. And you can't transition from one zone IA storage class to standard IA or to intelligent tiering, because from one zone IA, it can only go to Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive, mentioned by the red arrows. And you can't transition from Deep Archive to any other storage class. So when you do it to Deep Archive, you have to directly access those objects. You can't transition it back to any other object or any other storage class. So when it comes to the expiration, so we spoke about how do we transition our objects and all that. So every 30 days or every 90 days or every 180 days and so on, that we would transition our objects from one respective storage class to another. But when it comes to expiration, because I don't want to pay for a particular object when it's not even being accessed and not even being used, right? So those respective objects I would like to expire, or I would like to delete those objects at a later point of time. So these 2 points describe that. So when an object reaches the end of its lifetime, S3 queues it for removal and removes it asynchronously. So there may be a delay between the expiration date and the date at which S3 removes the object. Because every transaction in S3 is asynchronous transaction. So you will have to wait for a second or two for them to go ahead and remove all of your objects from that respective storage class, or from all the data centers that they have replicated that particular object onto. Because we saw that for S3 standard, for all the other storage classes except for one zone IA, your data is stored at minimum of 3 availability zones within that region. So you're not charged for the storage time associated with an object that has expired. And then over here, you can see that there is a catch to lifecycle transition. It states that if you create a lifecycle expiration rule that causes objects that have been in intelligent tiering, standard IA, or one zone IA for less than 30 days to expire, you are for sure charged for 30 days. So if you configure an expiration for 15 days or 16 days, that means you will for sure be charged for the upper limit, which is 30 days. And even if you do a life cycle expiration rule that causes objects that have been in Glacier to be expired less than 90 days, because in Glacier only after 90 days it will be expired. But if you do a configuration that is to expire that object from Glacier within that 90 days of time, you are still charged for 90 days. And even if you create an expiration rule that causes objects that have been in Deep Archive storage for less than 180 days to expire, that means let's say it's been in one zone IA or standard IA or intelligent tiering for 30 days, and then for 90 days it's been in Glacier, and then for less than 180 days it's been in Deep Archive, you will still be charged for 180 days, okay, which is 6 months of time. Okay, this is just a catch when you're using lifecycle transpiration and you're doing that expiration rule over here. Okay, so I think this is regarding lifecycle transition. Just understand that we will be able to transition from one storage class to another, and only forward transitions are allowed, no backward transitions allowed. Okay, and then you can just remember as to which storage class you would like to keep your object within for a specific amount of days, and then you would like to go ahead and transition it to a different storage class. And this configuration can be done on the console, and I'll show as to how to do that next. So we will look at the second configuration, which is called as cross-region replication when it comes to management of S3 objects. Okay, so replication enables automatic asynchronous copying of your objects across S3 buckets. Okay, so we have a source S3 bucket and we will have a destination S3 bucket, and we will configure replication. Okay, so these buckets are configured for object replication. So on the bucket level, you have to do that configuration, and can be owned by the same AWS account or by different AWS accounts. So that means that your destination bucket that you would like to copy the objects to from your source bucket can be in the same AWS account or can be in a different AWS account. So you can copy your objects between different AWS regions or directly within the same region itself. Okay, so it can be from one AWS account to another AWS account, and at the region level it can be between different AWS regions or within the same region. So to enable object replication, you use a bucket level configuration. So the management configuration should be done on the bucket level. So you add the replication configuration to your source bucket. The minimum configuration must provide the following: the destination bucket where you want to replicate your objects, and an IAM role to do that on your behalf. Because generally when we spoke about roles in IAM, we specify that if one service wants to talk to another service and do those actions on your behalf, we would need an IAM role. So similarly over here, you want AWS to go ahead and copy the contents of your bucket from your source bucket to a destination bucket that you own or someone else's own, but then you want to do the replication and you want AWS to do it on your behalf, right? So that means if you want any action that AWS has to do on your behalf, like copying the objects from one S3 bucket to another S3 bucket, an IAM role will be configured. Okay. So there are two types of cross-region replication. One that can happen from one AWS bucket to another AWS S3 bucket, which are in the different region. So I can have one AWS S3 bucket within the Northern Virginia region, and I can have one in Sydney, and I can do a cross-region replication configuration. So the second one is called a same region replication, which means both the S3 buckets are within the same AWS region. So within the same Northern Virginia region, but most of the time, I will have it across regions, because even if one region goes down at one point of time, I'll be able to still serve my end users from another AWS S3 bucket that I have placed in a different region. That's the main reason why I do cross-region replication. That is for disaster recovery purposes. So what is replication? And then we will see what is cross-region replication. And then we will now see as to when do you have to use replication and when do you have to use cross-region replication. So when do you want to use replication is if you want to replicate objects into a different storage class. Just now we saw that we were looking at lifecycle transition. We were looking at transitioning objects from one storage class to another and so on. But over here, what they mentioned using cross-region replication is, if suppose you would like to go ahead and replicate your objects from one S3 bucket to another S3 bucket, you will be using only one S3 bucket at all points of time as your source bucket. And your destination bucket, you may not be accessing those objects in the same frequent manner that you access your source bucket S3 objects. So at that point of time, what you will be doing is you will be keeping your destination S3 bucket objects in a different storage class than the source S3 bucket objects, because you want to pay much lesser, right, for the objects that you have in your destination S3 bucket. So you can use replication to directly put your objects into Glacier or Deep Archive or any other storage class in the destination bucket. You can also replicate your data to the same storage class and use lifecycle policies on the destination bucket to move your objects into a colder storage as it ages. So cross-region replication and lifecycle transition go hand in hand with each other. And the second reason when to use replication is to maintain object copies under different ownership. So regardless of who owns the source object, you can tell S3 to change the replica ownership to the AWS account that owns the destination bucket. So we saw that cross-region replication can also be done across AWS accounts, which means for the first AWS account, I am the owner, obviously. But then for the destination buckets AWS account, I may not be the owner. I can keep someone else as the owner over there. So this is referred to as owner override option. So you can use this option to restrict access to the object replicas, because if a hacker or if anyone tries to access your S3 bucket and find out what are the objects, the source bucket will be you as the owner, but then the destination bucket will have someone else as the owner, which will be a totally new AWS account, right? So it's very less possibility that a person will be able to find out and even try to access. But if both the source and the destination bucket are within the same AWS account, within two different regions, it's easy for a person to find out as to who the owner is, and it will be only part of one single AWS account. So these are the two reasons why we need to use replication. One is if you want to replicate your objects into a different storage class in your destination bucket. And the second one is when you want to maintain object copies under different ownership, just to restrict some of the access and follow certain regulations. So when to use cross-region replication, we have three reasons why. One is to meet compliance requirements, because we saw that Amazon S3 by default stores your data across multiple geographical distant availability zones. Okay, so minimum of 3 data centers they store your data across for compliance requirements. But then if suppose you want that compliance requirement to even last at much greater distances, right? So instead of 100 miles, I would like at least 1000 miles of distance. So that means at that point of time, what you can do is you can go ahead and configure cross region replication to have your source bucket in one region and your destination bucket in another region. It can be within the same or different AWS account. And the second reason why you have to use CRR is to minimize your latency. So if your customers are across the world or from 2 or 3 different geographical locations, you can minimize that latency in order for them to accessing the objects, okay, by maintaining your multiple object copies in different AWS regions. So for a person who's accessing your website from the Northern Virginia region is going to access the Northern Virginia related bucket, and the person who's accessing your website from Sydney region could be accessing your Sydney S3 bucket with the website content, right? So to minimize latency for your end users, you can go with cross region replication. And the next reason why you have to use that is to increase your operational efficiency. So let's say that, for example, you have 2 compute clusters in 2 different AWS regions that analyze the same set of objects. You might choose to maintain the object copies in those regions, because we saw with cross region replication, each and every object that you put into your source bucket is automatically replicated to the destination AWS bucket, which is in a totally different region. So if suppose you want to go ahead and do a compute analysis on both of your S3 buckets contents, it will be identical because you have used cross region replication. So for these three reasons, we can go ahead and use CRR. And then replication requires some of these followings. These are some of the things that we need to note before doing replications and after doing replication. So the source bucket owner must have the source and destination AWS regions enabled for their account. And the destination bucket owner must also have the destination region enabled for the account if your destination bucket is going to be in another AWS account. Okay. And both the source and destination buckets must have versioning enabled. Very, very important prerequisite before enabling cross-region replication, versioning should be enabled. And Amazon S3 must have permissions to replicate objects from the source to destination bucket on your behalf. So wherever you see this sentence where a service has to do something on your behalf, an IAM role has to be configured. So that is mentioned as the third point. And then the fourth point states that if the owner of the source bucket doesn't own the object in that bucket, the object owner must grant that bucket owner read and read ACP permissions with the access control list. So we saw that with our bucket ACL, right? With the permissions on that bucket, we will be able to grant another AWS account access to our bucket. So if the owner of that particular object is in a different AWS account, we can grant that AWS account access to our bucket. That means giving access to all of our objects within that bucket using read and read ACP permissions. So if the source bucket has object lock enabled, we saw this as one of the properties of S3. So if the source bucket has object lock enabled, and you can only enable object lock when you create the bucket, the destination bucket must also have object lock enabled. To enable replication on a bucket that has object lock enabled, you can contact AWS support to get more details from them as to how to do that. Okay, so the main points in these 6 points are the source bucket owner and the destination bucket owner should have those respective regions enabled where they want to place their buckets. And the second point, which is very important, is they both should have versioning enabled, both the source and destination bucket. Okay, and then an IAM role should be configured, which is the third point. The rest of the 3 points you may not come into that particular scenario while working in a company, but then the first 3 points are very important. Okay, so that's the end of the slide. So we will log into the AWS console. I have already logged into the AWS console, and I have come to the S3 dashboard. So in this S3 dashboard, we are going to first look at lifecycle transition configuration, and next we will be creating 2 buckets, one source bucket, one destination bucket, and then we will do the cross region replication. And you guys can just stick around for this because it's going to be very interesting. I will show you some of the actions that are possible with CRR. I will show you some of the actions that are not possible with CRR. But first, let's look at lifecycle transition. So we are going to create a bucket, and I'm going to place this bucket in Northern Virginia region. I'm going to give the bucket name as Akshay 2395-lifecycle. Okay, I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to disable this setting. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on create bucket. So our lifecycle bucket has been created. Click on the lifecycle bucket, click on management. You can see lifecycle and replication are added over here. Okay. So till now there is no lifecycle rule applied to this bucket. So what we will do is we will go ahead and upload an object first, and then we will configure our lifecycle transition. And then after 30 days, if suppose we still have this account with us, we will see how it works. So I'm going to upload my resume over here. Okay. I'm going to click on upload. So once I've uploaded the resume, I'm going to go back to the management tab. Okay. I'm going to go to lifecycle. I'm going to click on add lifecycle rule. So you can enter a rule name over here. Okay. So I'm going to enter a rule name. I'm going to call this as my lifecycle transition. You can give it any name that you want, but then, okay. So just be careful about some of the names that you give, because you will have to adhere to some of your organization's standards. Okay. So over here, I can add any prefix or tags or filter names for some of the objects that I want to do specifically for lifecycle transition, or any specific folder I want to do the transition for, and so on. But right now I want to do it on the entire bucket. I'm not going to do it for specific folders. So this will be applied across all folders, across all prefix. Okay. So I'm going to click on next. So under transition, you can see over here, we are going to do it for the current version as well as the previous version. So we can do both. So if you have versioning enabled, you will do it for both. Okay. So I don't have versioning enabled over here. Okay. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on into mark. I'm going to go ahead and enable versioning so that you can see both these configurations. Okay. I'm going to go to properties. I'm going to click on versioning, click on enable versioning, click on save. So now I'm going to go back to management, click on add lifecycle rule. I'm going to call this as my lifecycle transition. I'm going to click on next. So over here, I'm going to do it for both the current and previous version. So what we are going to do is for the current version, we don't have any transition set up right now. So I'm going to click on add transition. So I'm going to choose the transition to go to standard IA. By default is after 30 days, because you know for sure in the expiration setting that we saw right now, if you are going to transition it for 30 days or less than 30 days into standard IA, you will still be charged for 30 days. Okay. So we are going to do one more transition over here for our current versions of the objects. So we are going to click on the transition. We are going to transition it to Glacier after 60 days. Okay. So transitioning small objects into Glacier will increase cost. So this is just a message that they are giving. I'm going to click on I acknowledge that. And then we are going to add one more transition over here. I'm going to do it to Glacier Deep Archive. So you can see that all the other transitions right now have been disabled because it's already gone to Glacier. From standard IA, okay, we'll go back to the PPT. We'll go back to the diagram. You can see that. We'll correlate it. So we have done it from standard to standard IA. From standard IA, we have put it to Glacier. So from Glacier, we can only move it to Glacier Deep Archive. Okay. So we are going to move it to Glacier Deep Archive after 150 days. Okay. So for the previous versions of the object also, I'll maintain the same. So I'm going to move it to standard IA after 30. I'm going to add one more transition. I'm going to move it to, so there is a glitch in the UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do command minus and then minimize my screen so that let's see if that also works. Yeah. So I'm going to move it to, probably we'll do another transition over here. So for previous versions, we will move it to standard IA, and then we will move it to one zone IA after 60 days. And then we will do Glacier after 90 days. And then we will do Glacier Deep Archive after 180 days. Okay. I'll go back to the usual resolution. Yeah. Okay. So these are two types of transitions that we have done. One is from standard IA to Glacier Deep Archive. So after 150 days, for sure, we will know from the time that you created the object, after 150 days, it will be in Glacier Deep Archive. And then over here, only after 180 days, it will go to Glacier Deep Archive for previous versions, because I want the previous versions to stay for a little more longer period of time. Okay. So that even if my current version is being deleted, I will still have access to my previous versions of the objects. So just a small note over here that I want to do for my company right now. But then it depends totally on your company's lifecycle transition rules or the standards that they are following, for which you will need to configure. So these are the transitions that we have configured. So next we'll move on to the expiration settings. So for expiration also you have for current version and previous version. So we are going to, by default, these numbers are populated based on your previous transition policies. Okay. So you can check over here. Okay. So you can just click on this and see for versioning enabled buckets, an expire action retains the current version as a previous version and places the delete marker. Because we have versioning enabled, we saw that if your current version is deleted, all that it will do is place a delete marker. So if you want to permanently delete previous versions, combine the expiration action with the delete version, delete for previous version action. So he says that combine this particular setting with this particular setting if you have versioning enabled, because when you delete an object which has a current version, it will only place a delete marker, right? But then if you want to delete that delete marker itself, you will have to configure this setting which says permanently delete all your previous versions. So after 545 days, that is after a year and so on, after a year and few months, you will not see any objects within this S3 bucket, because they would have transitioned from each and every storage class to Glacier Deep Archive, and from Glacier Deep Archive, it will be sitting from 180 days until 545 days for previous versions, 150 days to 515 days for current versions. Okay. So you can go ahead and clean up incomplete multi-part uploads. So if you are uploading big files to S3, it will be uploaded as paths. So you can go on to clean up some of these incomplete multi-part uploads also after 7 days from start of your upload. So this setting is only if you want to upload big objects. Okay. So we are going to enable this setting. So this is regarding expiration. Okay. We are going to leave the defaults itself, but then your organization may need some other defaults, like after 360 days over here, and then after 400 days over here. Okay. So you can just go ahead and click on next, click on review these settings. So you can see over here, you have given the lifecycle transition name, and then you can specify whether you want it for a specific prefix or for the whole bucket. We have done it for the entire bucket. And then you can see over here, we have done our transitions for the current versions of the objects and our transitions for the previous versions of the objects. And then our expiration settings have been mentioned over here. When you click on save, automatically your settings are saved. So you have a rule that will be displayed over here for lifecycle transition. Okay. So this is how you do lifecycle transition configuration on the entire bucket. Okay. So if you want to specify it to a specific folder, you can go ahead and edit this and put it to a specific prefix or to a specific folder. So all the objects within that folder will follow this lifecycle transition policies. So when you come to overview, right now it's an S3 standard. So after 30 days of time, you should see that it goes to S3IA. So probably when we continue this class, probably I'll show it to you. So today's date is today's date is 29th. So 29th of November or at the end of November, you should see it transition to standard storage class. Okay, from standard IA. Okay. So the next configuration that we are going to see is regarding cross-region replication. So for cross-region replication, what we are going to go ahead and do is we are going to create two buckets. One bucket that will be placed in the Northern Virginia region and the other bucket that will be placed in the Sydney region. So we'll go ahead and create a bucket. So we are going to call this bucket as a source bucket, Akshay 2395 source NV for Northern Virginia. Okay. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to disable block all public access. Click on next and then click on create bucket. So we have our source NV bucket. So similarly, I'm going to create another bucket called as the destination bucket. Actually 2395 destination Sid for Sydney. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Asia Pacific Sydney. So you can see that these two buckets are in two corners of the world. Okay. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on next. Disable this block all public access. Click on next. Click on create bucket. Okay. So we have both of our source and destination buckets over here. So destination SID bucket is in Sydney and the source bucket is in Northern Virginia. So we are going to go to the source bucket. And first what we are going to do is we are going to upload an object. So listen very carefully when it comes to this. I'm going to add a file. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and upload an object. So I'm going to upload an image. Click on upload. So right now we still haven't enabled cross-region replication, but then after we enable it, we will see some of the properties of cross-region replication. So right now we have uploaded this object and now we are going to go to management and we are going to go to replication and then we are going to click on add rule. So we have one object in the source bucket. So after enabling cross-region replication, we can see whether that object that we added to the source bucket is replicated or not. Okay. So we'll click on add rule. So it immediately states that this bucket doesn't have versioning enabled. So that is a prerequisite. So I'm going to enable versioning on this bucket. And you can see that we can do the cross-region replication for a specific prefix, like how we saw it in lifecycle transition, or we can do it for the entire source bucket. So I'm going to do it for the entire source bucket. Okay. I'm not going to do it for a specific prefix or tag. And then you can see over here, you can also encrypt your objects using KMS while doing the replication. Okay. So all your objects will be replicated and encrypted also at the same time, even in your destination bucket. Okay. So we are not going to do replication with encryption over here. We are just going to leave the same default configuration. I'm going to click on next. So the destination S3 bucket you can choose over here. So immediately when you choose your destination S3 bucket, I'm going to choose the destination SID bucket that I placed in the Sydney region. Immediately it should state the bucket does not have versioning enabled. So another prerequisite. So like I mentioned, both the source and destination bucket should have versioning enabled. So I'm going to enable versioning on the destination bucket from this same UI itself. And then you can see over here, you can change the object ownership to a different bucket owner, or you can also go ahead and do this configuration where you want to change the storage class for the replicated objects. So I'm going to change the storage class for the replicated objects in the destination Sydney bucket from over here. It's standard. Over there, I want it to be standard IA. Okay. So I'm going to click on next. I'm not going to change the bucket ownership to some other AWS account, but then you can also do that over here. You can specify the account ID. Okay. I'm not going to do that. And then click on next. So this is going to be our rule option. So I can choose to create a new role. Okay. Or if I have the role already created, I can go ahead and use the same role. But right now I don't have any IAM roles created for me to go ahead and do the replication for AWS S3 to do the replication on my behalf. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and give the rule a name. So the name I'm going to give is my CRR configuration. But again, according to your organization standards and policies, give it an appropriate name. Okay. So I'm going to keep the status as enabled right now. I'm going to go to review settings. So you can see if the source bucket, we are going to do it to the entire bucket. And even we are going to do the replication to a destination bucket that is in the Sydney region. Okay. And the storage class is going to be standard over here. It's going to be standard IA over here. And then under the options, we have configured an IAM role. We are telling AWS S3 to go ahead and create a new IAM role. And we have given the role a name. Okay. And we have given the status as enabled. So this is across regions. We can also do it to the same region replication. That configuration is also possible. I'm going to click on save. So once I click on save, automatically an IAM role is created for you in the background. So that role is denoted as S3 CRR underscore role underscore for underscore source bucket name underscore to underscore destination bucket name. And since there is a minimum character length, you don't see the destination bucket with SYD over here as the ending. Okay, so cool. So you can see that this role has been created and even a bucket policy has been added. So when you go to permissions and you go to bucket policy on the source bucket or the destination bucket, you will see the bucket policy. So what we are going to do is I'm going to open S3 in another tab. Okay. I'm going to go to the destination bucket, destination SID bucket. I'm going to go to permissions and check out whether there's a bucket policy that is added. Okay. So no bucket policy has been added. So you can go ahead and go to management, go to replications on the source bucket. And then even if you want, you can copy the bucket policy. So we are going to see how this bucket policy looks like. Okay. So I'm going to open my Visual Studio Code. Okay. And over here, I'm going to file, new file. I'm going to paste this bucket policy. So you can see over here, the bucket policy states that these are the actions that I am allowing for the root user to these two buckets. Okay. Which is my destination bucket to all the objects. So this is how you do the cross-region replication. So it's through the IAM role that you do that, or you can also do that through a bucket policy. Okay. So from the, you're giving permissions for the root user to the destination bucket and all the objects within the destination bucket denoted by / and star. So instead of pasting this bucket policy, we are going ahead with the IAM role. And you can see over here, this is the source bucket and this is the destination bucket. Under the overview tab, you don't see any files. But in the source bucket, we saw that we have a file. Why didn't this file get replicated? That is the general question a person asks. So the answer to that is, whenever you enable cross-region replication, the files that you uploaded prior to enabling cross-region replications will not be replicated. Any objects that you upload after you enable cross-region replication only will be replicated. Okay. So we are going to go ahead and upload another object right now. Okay. And this object, I'm going to upload it as probably my resume. I'm going to click on upload. So once you click on upload over here, you can see that the storage class is going to be standard for my resume. Okay. So any new put actions after you have enabled cross-region replication will be replicated to the destination bucket. Any put actions that you have done before enabling cross-region replication will not be updated or will not be replicated to the destination bucket. So now if I go ahead and click on the refresh button over here, I should see my resume in the destination bucket, which is in the Sydney region. So it asynchronously went ahead and copied my object or my resume from the source bucket, which resides in Northern Virginia, to the destination bucket, which resides in Sydney. So similarly, we are going to do one more thing. We are going to update my resume and probably change its size or update a second version of this file. And we are going to see whether there are two versions in the destination bucket. So even an updation action we should look at. So we saw the put action right now. Let's look at the update action. So I'm going to upload the same file again. Let's see if it has two versions. Okay, I'm going to upload the same file again. I'm going to click on upload. So once I click on upload, let's go ahead and click on show versions. Okay. So once I click on show versions for the resume alone, I have two versions right now, right? For the resumes alone, I have two versions. When I go to the destination bucket and I click on show for the resume alone, I have two versions, right? Both residing in the standard IA. So that means even for an update action, right? Even for an update action, 341.54 is the timestamp, 341.54 is the timestamp, 340.45 is the timestamp, 340.45 is the timestamp. So I have two objects, again, two versions of the same object in the destination bucket. So a put action uploads the object to the source bucket. After enabling cross-region replication, replicates it to the destination bucket. Similarly, an update action also is replicated to the destination bucket. What about a delete action? So let's go ahead and go to hide versions. Even over here, let's go to hide versions. We saw in versioning, when it comes to hiding your versions and deleting an object, and when it comes to showing your versions and deleting an object, we saw that in the versioning class itself. So when we are going to go ahead and do hide versioning, and we are going to go ahead and click on this object, and we are going to click on delete, we are going to click on delete. What happens in the source bucket is under show versions, you can see that a delete marker has been placed. But what happens in the destination bucket? Whether delete is propagated, whether delete is replicated or not. So we will look at the destination bucket. We are going to click on refresh over here. The object still resides over here. And when you click on show versions, you see that there is no change, which is brilliant, right? This is brilliant. This configuration has been brought out by Amazon only because if you delete any of your objects in the source bucket, that delete is not propagated to the destination bucket. Okay, because generally a destination bucket that you will configure will be used for disaster recovery scenarios. So even if a person accidentally goes ahead and deletes some of your objects in your source bucket, you will still have those objects in your destination bucket. So just to be sure about that, even if you want to do one or two more refresh, you can do that. You will still have your object over here, but in your source bucket, a delete marker has been placed. So what happens if you go ahead and do delete of all these versions? That means you are actually deleting your objects. You're actually deleting your object entirely with show versions enabled. Your object has been totally deleted. This is the image that we uploaded. We don't need to care about this image right now. But when we go to a destination bucket, you can see over here what happens. Your objects are still residing. Even if you click on show versions, your objects are still residing. So that means a delete only does not take effect. A put action, which uploads a new file after you have enabled cross-region replication, okay, will go ahead and replicate your object. An update action will be replicated. A delete action will not be replicated. Irrespective of whether you do hide and show versioning and you go ahead and delete your object, it does not take into effect. But in your source bucket, that object will be deleted itself. Okay. So that's the reason why we have cross-region replication, only because since most of the companies are using it for disaster recovery purposes, any object that you delete in the source bucket by mistake or so on will not be replicated to the destination bucket. And one final thing regarding cross-region replication is you can't do daisy chaining. So when I mean by daisy chaining, what I mean is that you can't have one source bucket and replicate your objects to multiple destination buckets. That will not work. So I can't have one source bucket in Northern Virginia, and I can't have three destination buckets in three different regions, and I go ahead and configure cross-region replication. That will not work. So what AWS states is that You can do cross-region replication only from one source bucket to one destination bucket. So that means if you want to replicate your objects across one more region also, they say use one source bucket, one destination bucket, and on the destination bucket, configure that as the source for another destination bucket. But generally in most exams, we will not have cross-region replication done across three buckets. Okay, we will only have one source bucket and one destination bucket. But even if you want to go ahead and do it for one more destination bucket in another AWS region, like you have your source bucket in Northern Virginia, you have your destination bucket in Mumbai, you have another destination bucket in Sydney. How you have to do that configuration is from Northern Virginia bucket to Mumbai bucket, from Mumbai bucket to Sydney bucket. So you can only do cross-region replication in such a manner rather than doing it from one source bucket directly to multiple destination buckets. That's not allowed. You can't do it from Northern Virginia simultaneously to Mumbai and to Sydney. You can only do it from Northern Virginia to Mumbai and then from Mumbai to Sydney. So on two buckets, you will have to configure your cross-region replication rule. Okay. So this is it regarding lifecycle transition and cross-region replication. So I will stop the recording right now and we'll be open up for questions. Okay. So just a second. Where do I? Okay.